The crystal earrings my grandmother left me caught the restaurant's dim lighting as I adjusted them one final time, their faceted surfaces throwing tiny rainbows across the white tablecloth. 23 years had passed since her funeral, yet I still wore them to every family gathering, a small rebellion against my daughter-in-law Sandra's endless stream of passive-aggressive comments about my outdated jewelry. Tonight's dinner at Romano's was supposed to celebrate my son Michael's promotion to district manager, but Sandra had already made 3 cutting remarks about my navy dress being so very practical, and my choice to order the salmon instead of something more adventurous. The familiar weight of those earrings reminded me of Grandma Rose's final words about keeping family treasures close to your heart, though I had no idea how prophetic that advice would prove to be before the evening ended. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to know how family dynamics play out in your part of the world. Michael was cutting his ribeye with surgical precision, avoiding eye contact as Sandra launched into her latest monologue about their upcoming kitchen renovation. She gestured with her wine glass, the Chardonnay sloshing dangerously close to the rim as she described granite countertops that would cost more than my monthly Social Security check. "Of course, we're going with the absolute best materials," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone she reserved for discussions of money in front of me. "Michael's new salary means we don't have to compromise on quality anymore." The implied contrast hung in the air like smoke from the restaurant's wood-fired grill, where the chef was preparing someone else's celebration meal. I took a careful sip of my water, noting how Sandra's manicured nails drummed against her glass in a rhythm that suggested she was building towards something bigger than kitchen complaints. The appetizer plates had been cleared away, leaving small puddles of olive oil on the table that reflected the flickering candlelight from our corner booth. Sandra's voice grew louder as she moved from renovation plans to vacation dreams, each destination more exotic and expensive than the last. "We're thinking Tuscany in September," she announced, as if the very words tasted like fine wine on her tongue. "Michael deserves to see how real Italians live, not just eat at places like this." Her dismissive wave encompassed Romano's entire dining room, where families were enjoying their Friday night meals in blissful ignorance of her commentary. I caught our waiter's eye and offered an apologetic smile, remembering how Grandma Rose always said you could judge a person's character by how they treated service workers. Sandra had already sent back her Caesar salad twice, claiming the dressing was too garlicky, and then not garlicky enough. My purse sat beside me on the burgundy leather banquette, its worn clasp catching the light as I absently fidgeted with the metal closure. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper and tucked into the interior pocket where I'd carried it for over 2 decades, was a small velvet pouch that contained more than Sandra could possibly imagine. She was still talking about Tuscan villas when the couple at the next table began arguing in hushed tones about their credit card bill, their financial stress creating ripples of tension that seemed to spread through the restaurant's intimate atmosphere. "Money changes everything," the woman whispered to her companion, and I found myself nodding in agreement while Sandra described her planned shopping excursions through Florence's luxury boutiques. The irony wasn't lost on me that she was discussing 6-figure renovations while I sat there, knowing I could probably buy the entire restaurant if I chose to reveal my secret. Sandra paused in her Italian fantasies long enough to critique my meal choice again, noting how I'd only eaten half of my salmon fillet. "Are you feeling all right, Mom?" she asked, though her tone suggested concern was the last thing on her mind. "You seem a bit subdued tonight." Michael finally looked up from his plate, his eyes reflecting the same weariness I'd seen growing in him over the past few years of marriage. He'd once been such a vibrant young man, full of dreams about opening his own accounting firm and maybe writing that novel he'd outlined in college. Now he seemed content to let Sandra plan their entire future while he nodded along and signed the checks. The transformation reminded me painfully of how his father had gradually lost himself during our own troubled marriage, before cancer claimed him when Michael was just 16. Some patterns repeat themselves across generations, despite our best efforts to break the cycle. "I'm perfectly fine," I replied, setting down my fork and reaching for my purse with deliberate slowness. The motion caused my grandmother's earrings to sway gently, their tiny diamonds catching the light and throwing sparkles across Sandra's surprised face. She'd never asked about the earrings' history or significance, dismissing them as costume jewelry from another era during one particularly memorable Thanksgiving dinner. If she'd bothered to look closely, she might have noticed the hallmarks that indicated their true value, or the way other women in upscale restaurants occasionally glanced at them with knowing appreciation. But Sandra's attention was always focused on newer, flashier things, the kind of status symbols that announce their worth to casual observers rather than revealing their secrets to those who understood quality. Tonight, however, she was about to learn that appearances could be devastatingly deceptive. The restaurant's ambiance had shifted subtly as the evening progressed, with more couples arriving for late dinner reservations and the lighting growing dimmer to create a more intimate atmosphere. Sandra was describing her plans to completely redesign their master bedroom when she suddenly stopped mid-sentence and fixed me with the kind of stare usually reserved for particularly stubborn stains. "You know, Mom," she said, her voice taking on that artificially sweet tone I'd learned to recognize as a warning signal, "I've been thinking about your living situation." Michael's fork clattered against his plate as he set it down too quickly, creating a sharp sound that seemed to echo through our corner of the restaurant. The older couple at the table behind us paused their own conversation, and I could feel their attention shifting toward our increasingly tense exchange. Sandra's smile widened as she sensed she had an audience for whatever performance she was planning to deliver. "My living situation is perfectly adequate," I said carefully, though my hand tightened involuntarily around my purse's handle. Sandra's laugh was light and musical, the kind of sound that might have seemed charming to casual observers who couldn't see the calculation behind her eyes. She leaned forward conspiratorially, as if sharing a delicious secret rather than preparing to humiliate me in front of a room full of strangers. "Oh, Mom, we both know that tiny apartment isn't really suitable for someone your age," she continued, her voice carrying just enough volume to ensure nearby diners could hear every word. The couple behind us had definitely stopped eating, and I noticed our waiter hovering near the bar, pretending to polish glasses while obviously listening to our conversation. Sandra was building towards something spectacular, and the anticipation in the air was almost palpable as other patrons began to sense the approaching drama. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his napkin twisting between his fingers as he avoided looking directly at either of us. "Sandra, maybe we should discuss this at home," he murmured. But she waved away his suggestion with an impatient gesture that made her wedding ring catch the candlelight. The 3-carat diamond she'd insisted on for their engagement had cost Michael most of his savings at the time, though she'd never seemed entirely satisfied with its size when comparing it to her friends' rings. "Nonsense," she replied brightly. "This affects all of us, and Mom deserves to know we're looking out for her best interests." Her emphasis on the word "deserves" carried enough sarcasm to make several nearby diners glance in our direction with poorly concealed curiosity. The restaurant's gentle buzz of conversation had quieted noticeably as more people became aware of the tension emanating from our table, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. Sandra reached across the table and placed her hand over mine with exaggerated tenderness, her perfectly manicured nails forming a sharp contrast against my age-spotted skin. "We've found a lovely senior community about an hour from here," she announced, her voice now pitched to carry clearly throughout our section of the restaurant. "It's very affordable, and they have all sorts of activities for people in your situation." The word "situation" hung in the air like a neon sign advertising my supposed poverty and helplessness to anyone within earshot. I could feel the weight of curious stares from other diners, some sympathetic, others merely entertained by the unfolding family drama. Sandra's grip on my hand tightened slightly, preventing me from pulling away as she continued her public performance of concerned daughter-in-law. "The best part is, you won't have to worry about rent or utilities or any of those complicated financial matters that can be so overwhelming for someone your age." The condescension in her voice was thick enough to cut with a knife, and I watched Michael's face flush red with embarrassment as he finally began to understand the scope of his wife's planned humiliation. "Sandra, please," he said again, but his voice lacked conviction, carrying the defeated tone of a man who'd lost too many battles to believe he could win this one. She ignored him completely, her attention focused entirely on me as she prepared to deliver what she clearly considered the coup de grâce of her performance. The wonderful thing about Sunset Gardens is that it's specifically designed for people with limited resources, she continued, her voice growing even more theatrical. They understand that not everyone can afford the nicer facilities, and they really do their best to make it comfortable for folks who don't have family money to fall back on. Several nearby tables had stopped all pretense of eating, their occupants now openly watching our exchange with the fascination typically reserved for traffic accidents or reality television shows. My grandmother's earrings seemed to grow warmer against my earlobes as Sandra built toward her climax, and I could almost hear Grandma Rose's voice whispering the words she'd spoken to me so many years ago about dignity under fire. "The thing is, Mom," Sandra said, leaning even closer and lowering her voice to a stage whisper that somehow managed to be more audible than her previous pronouncements. "Michael and I think it would be best if you moved there soon, before winter makes the transition more difficult." She paused for dramatic effect, her eyes scanning the nearby tables to ensure she had maximum audience participation for her finale. The restaurant seemed to hold its collective breath as she prepared to deliver the line she'd obviously been rehearsing. "After all, you're just an old woman with no money, and continuing to pretend otherwise isn't doing anyone any favors." Her voice rose sharply on the final words, ensuring that even diners across the room could hear her pronouncement. "Sit quietly, Grandma," she continued, using the title like a weapon rather than a term of endearment. "The whole restaurant is watching, and we don't want to make this any more embarrassing than it has to be." The silence that followed her words was profound and uncomfortable, broken only by the gentle clink of silverware from the kitchen and the soft jazz music playing through the restaurant's sound system. Michael had gone completely pale, his hands frozen in midair as if he'd been reaching for something but forgotten what it was. The couple behind us were staring openly now, along with most of the other diners in our section, creating the kind of public spectacle that Sandra had clearly been orchestrating from the moment we sat down. She sat back in her chair with evident satisfaction, apparently believing she'd successfully established her dominance over the family hierarchy in front of an audience that would remember her performance. What she didn't know was that I'd been carrying the means to completely reverse this dynamic for over 20 years. My purse seemed heavier as I lifted it onto the table, its worn leather surface reflecting the candlelight as I carefully undid the clasp that had secured countless secrets over the decades. Sandra watched with obvious amusement, probably expecting me to fumble for tissues or perhaps pull out an outdated checkbook to pathetically offer payment for dinner. The other diners maintained their fascinated silence, clearly anticipating either a tearful breakdown or an equally embarrassing attempt at self-defense from the poor old woman who'd just been so thoroughly put in her place. Michael was staring at his hands, apparently unable to face the humiliation his wife had created for all of us. But as my fingers found the familiar texture of the velvet pouch I'd carried like a talisman for so many years, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. Grandma Rose had always said that dignity wasn't about what others thought of you, but about knowing your own worth when the chips were down. The velvet pouch was warm from being pressed against my body through the fabric of my purse, and its weight felt significant as I withdrew it from its hiding place. Sandra's eyebrows rose slightly in curiosity, though her expression still carried that smug satisfaction of someone who believed she'd already won the war. "What's that, Mom?" she asked, in a tone usually reserved for addressing small children who'd brought something interesting to show and tell. The nearby diners leaned forward almost imperceptibly, drawn into our drama despite themselves, while Michael finally looked up with an expression of growing dread. He knew me well enough to recognize when I was reaching my limit, though he had no idea what I was capable of when pushed beyond endurance. The restaurant's atmosphere had become electric with anticipation, as if everyone present sensed that something significant was about to shift in the carefully orchestrated power dynamic Sandra had spent the evening establishing. I set the velvet pouch on the white tablecloth between us, where it created a small, dark island in the sea of Sandra's confident assumptions. The fabric was worn smooth from decades of handling, its deep burgundy color faded to a rich wine that seemed to absorb the candlelight rather than reflect it. "This," I said quietly, my voice carrying clearly in the expectant silence, "belonged to my grandmother Rose." Sandra's laugh was sharp and dismissive, the sound cutting through the hushed atmosphere like breaking glass. "Oh, Mom, please don't tell me you're about to show us some sentimental trinket," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. We really don't have time for another story about the good old days when everything was supposedly better. Several nearby diners exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to recognize Sandra as the villain in this particular family drama, though she remained blissfully unaware of how the audience's sympathy was shifting. My fingers worked slowly at the velvet pouch's drawstring, extending the moment as Sandra continued her commentary about outdated family heirlooms and their lack of practical value in the modern world. "I know you think these old things have meaning," she said, gesturing dismissively at my grandmother's earrings. "But honestly, Mom, it's time to face reality about your financial situation." The irony of her words wasn't lost on me as I finally loosened the drawstring and began to open the pouch that contained more reality than she was prepared to handle. Michael had stopped breathing entirely, his eyes fixed on my hands as if he could somehow prevent whatever was about to happen through sheer force of will. The other diners had abandoned all pretense of their own meals, creating an audience that Sandra had inadvertently assembled for her own downfall. Even our waiter had moved closer, ostensibly to refill water glasses, but clearly fascinated by the unfolding drama at table 12. The first item I withdrew from the pouch was a small folded document that looked deceptively ordinary despite its extraordinary contents. Sandra glanced at it with mild interest, probably assuming it was some kind of outdated insurance policy or perhaps a deed to a tiny plot of land somewhere. "What's that supposed to be?" she asked, though her tone suggested she didn't really care about the answer. I unfolded the document carefully, its crisp edges contrasting sharply with the worn velvet from which it had emerged. The letterhead at the top was elegantly embossed with the name of a law firm that specialized in estate planning for high-net-worth individuals, though I'd learned over the years not to mention such details in casual conversation. "This is a certificate," I said simply, smoothing the paper against the tablecloth where the restaurant's lighting could illuminate its contents. "It represents my ownership of 437 shares of Berkshire Hathaway Class A stock." The silence that followed my words was different from the expectant hush that had preceded it. This was the stunned quiet of people trying to process information that didn't match their existing assumptions. Sandra's expression shifted from dismissive amusement to confused irritation, as if I'd suddenly started speaking in a foreign language. "Berkshire what?" she asked, though something in her tone suggested she was beginning to sense that the ground beneath her feet wasn't as solid as she'd believed. Michael's face had gone completely white, and his hands were gripping the edge of the table as if he needed physical support to remain upright. The couple behind us was no longer even pretending to eat, their own conversation forgotten as they strained to hear every word of our exchange. Even the background music seemed quieter, as if the universe itself was holding its breath to see how this revelation would unfold in the intimate setting of Romano's dining room. I reached back into the velvet pouch and withdrew a second document, this one bearing the official seal and signatures that transformed it from mere paper into legal proof of extraordinary wealth. "Each share," I continued in the same calm voice I'd used to read bedtime stories to Michael when he was small, "is currently worth approximately $543,000. The mathematics hung in the air like a physical presence, their implications rippling outward through the restaurant as nearby diners began whispering calculations to each other. Sandra's mouth had fallen open slightly, creating an unflattering expression that revealed how little she understood about the forces she'd been mocking. Her earlier confidence was evaporating like steam from a cup of coffee, replaced by a dawning realization that she'd catastrophically misjudged her target. The Berkshire Hathaway certificates represented wealth that most people could only dream of, yet I'd been carrying them in my purse like family photographs while she lectured me about affordable senior housing. "That's impossible," Sandra whispered, though her voice lacked conviction as the reality of the numbers began to penetrate her shock. "Old people don't have investments like that." Her statement revealed more about her assumptions than she probably intended, and I saw Michael wince at the casual ageism in her words. The nearby diners had given up all pretense of privacy, openly craning their necks to get a better view of the documents spread across our table. Our waiter had approached with a fresh bottle of wine, though he seemed more interested in the drama unfolding at our table than in actually pouring drinks. "Your grandmother left these to you?" Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, remembering the day 23 years ago when the lawyer had handed me the velvet pouch and explained that Grandma Rose had been quietly accumulating Berkshire Hathaway stock for over 30 years, reinvesting dividends and adding to her position whenever she had spare money. The third document I withdrew showed the current market value of my holdings, updated just that morning by my investment advisor at Morgan Stanley. The figure at the bottom of the page was printed in bold black ink: $237,461,000. Sandra made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a whimper, her face cycling through expressions of disbelief, shock, and dawning horror as she began to understand the magnitude of her miscalculation. The couple at the next table was now openly discussing the numbers they'd overheard, their voices creating a buzz of excitement that seemed to spread through the restaurant like wildfire. $200 million, the woman whispered to her companion, who nearly choked on his wine. Michael was staring at the documents as if they might disappear if he looked away, his face showing the kind of amazement typically reserved for miracle sightings or lottery winners. "But you live in that tiny apartment," Sandra managed to say, though her voice had lost all its earlier authority and now carried the plaintive tone of someone whose entire worldview was crumbling in real time. "You shop at discount stores. You clip coupons." Her litany of my supposedly poverty-stricken behaviors revealed how little she'd understood about the difference between being careful with money and actually lacking it. I'd learned from Grandma Rose that true wealth often looked different from what people expected, that the flashiest displays of prosperity were usually the least sustainable. "I live simply because I choose to," I replied, carefully folding the documents and returning them to their velvet sanctuary. "My grandmother taught me that money should work for you, not define you." The restaurant had grown quiet again as other diners absorbed the implications of what they'd witnessed, creating an atmosphere charged with the electricity that follows sudden, dramatic reversals of fortune. Sandra's face had taken on an unhealthy pallor that made her expensive makeup look garish under the restaurant's warm lighting. She kept glancing around the dining room as if hoping to find some escape from the public humiliation she'd inadvertently orchestrated for herself. "This changes everything," she said finally, though whether she was speaking to me, to Michael, or to the universe in general remained unclear. The other diners were now actively discussing our situation, their voices creating a low hum of conversation that centered entirely around the elderly woman who just revealed herself to be worth more than most small companies. Our waiter had given up all pretense of professional distance and was openly staring at our table with the kind of fascination usually reserved for celebrity sightings. I could feel the weight of dozens of eyes upon me, but strangely, the attention felt liberating rather than uncomfortable, as if I'd finally stepped out from behind a curtain I'd been hiding behind for decades. Michael found his voice first, though it came out cracked and uncertain. "Mom, why didn't you ever tell us about this?" His question carried genuine hurt along with amazement, and I felt a pang of guilt for keeping such a significant secret from my only child for so many years. "Your grandmother made me promise to keep it private unless someone truly needed to know," I explained, though the explanation felt inadequate given the circumstances. "She said that money changes how people see you, how they treat you, and she wanted me to know who my real friends were before they knew what I was worth." Sandra's earlier words about me being just an old woman with no money seemed to echo through the restaurant like a ghostly reminder of her spectacular misjudgment. The irony was almost poetic. She'd assembled an audience to witness my supposed humiliation, only to create the perfect stage for her own downfall. The fourth item I withdrew from the velvet pouch was smaller but no less significant. A business card for my private wealth management advisor at Goldman Sachs, its heavy cardstock and embossed lettering marking it as the kind of accessory that only serious money could command. Sandra stared at it as if it were written in hieroglyphics, clearly struggling to reconcile the evidence before her eyes with her fixed assumptions about my financial status. "I've been working with them for over 2 decades, I said quietly, sliding the card across the table where it created another small crack in her crumbling confidence. "They've helped me diversify beyond just the Berkshire stock. Real estate investments, municipal bonds, a few technology companies that my advisor thought showed promise." The casual mention of a diversified portfolio worth hundreds of millions of dollars hung in the air like expensive perfume. its implications rippling through our section of the restaurant as other diners absorbed the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Real estate investments, Michael repeated slowly, as if testing the words for reality. Mom, do you own properties? The question seemed to surprise him as much as my answer would, and I could see him mentally reviewing every conversation we'd had about money, housing, and financial security over the past several years. 17 rental properties across 3 states, I replied matter-of-factly, enjoying the way Sandra's eyes widened with each new revelation. 2 shopping centers in Florida, an apartment complex in Denver, and several office buildings that provide steady cash flow. The litany of real estate holdings sounded almost surreal in the intimate setting of Romano's dining room, where families usually discussed vacation plans and weekend activities rather than multi-million-dollar property portfolios. Our waiter had completely abandoned his professional duties and was now standing near our table with undisguised fascination, while the couple behind us had given up all pretense of their own meal to focus entirely on our unfolding drama. Sandra's transformation was remarkable to witness. The confident, condescending woman who'd been lecturing me about senior housing had been replaced by someone who looked physically smaller, as if the revelation of my wealth had actually caused her to shrink in her chair. But the way you dress, she stammered, grasping for some explanation that might restore her sense of reality. Your car, your apartment, the coupons. Her voice trailed off as she began to understand that everything she'd interpreted as evidence of poverty had actually been evidence of something far more sophisticated, the kind of financial confidence that didn't need external validation. I drive a 12-year-old Honda because it's reliable and efficient, I explained patiently. I live in a modest apartment because I don't need space to impress anyone. And I use coupons because spending money unnecessarily isn't wisdom, it's waste. The nearby diners were nodding in appreciation of this philosophy, creating a chorus of approval that seemed to further deflate Sandra's remaining confidence. The 5th document from my velvet pouch was perhaps the most devastating of all. A letter from the mayor's office thanking me for my anonymous donation of $5 million to build the new children's wing at the county hospital. Sandra read the letter twice, her lips moving silently as she struggled to process the information, while Michael made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. You built the children's wing? He asked, his voice filled with wonder. That's why they have the plaque thanking a generous anonymous donor in the lobby. I nodded, remembering the satisfaction I'd felt watching the construction progress from my apartment window, knowing that sick children would have a brighter, more comfortable place to heal. Grandma Rose always said that money was only valuable if it could help people, I explained, though the words felt inadequate to express the deep satisfaction that came from being able to make a real difference in my community. The restaurant had transformed around us into something resembling a theater, with our table serving as the stage for a drama that none of the other diners had expected to witness during their Friday night meals. Sandra was staring at the donation letter as if it might somehow change its contents through sheer force of will, while conversations at nearby tables buzzed with excitement about the elderly woman who'd just revealed herself to be a secret philanthropist worth hundreds of millions. $5 million, someone whispered loudly enough for half the restaurant to hear. She gave away $5 million, and nobody even knew it was her. The admiration in their voices created a stark contrast to Sandra's obvious distress, and I could see her beginning to understand that she'd not only misjudged my financial situation, but had also done so in front of an audience that was now viewing her as the villain in our family's story. Michael was shaking his head slowly, a gesture that seemed to encompass amazement, regret, and dawning understanding all at once. All those times you said you couldn't afford to join us for expensive dinners, he said, his voice carrying a note of accusation. All those times Sandra suggested you might need help with your bills. His words created another uncomfortable moment for his wife, who was now looking around the restaurant as if searching for an emergency exit. I wanted to see how you both treated me when you thought I had nothing, I replied, though the explanation felt somehow both necessary and insufficient. Grandma Rose taught me that a person's character shows most clearly when they believe they have nothing to gain from being kind. The moral weight of this statement seemed to settle over our table like a heavy blanket, creating an atmosphere charged with implications that none of us could ignore. The sixth and final item I withdrew from the velvet pouch was the one that would complete Sandra's humiliation, a checkbook bearing the logo of J.P. Morgan Private Bank, the kind of financial institution that only accepted clients with assets exceeding $25 million. Sandra stared at it as if it were a snake that might bite her, while the gold embossing on its leather cover caught the candlelight and threw tiny reflections across the table. "I could write a check right now," I said quietly, opening the checkbook to reveal a register showing a current balance of over $15 million in just this one account. "I could buy this restaurant, or the entire building it's housed in, or pay for your Tuscan vacation with pocket change." The casual mention of such vast liquid wealth seemed to suck the air out of our section of the dining room, creating a silence so complete that I could hear the soft jazz music playing in the background and the distant sound of dishes being washed in the kitchen. Sandra's face had progressed through several shades of pale and was now approaching a greenish tint that suggested actual nausea. "I don't understand," she whispered, though her words carried less conviction than confusion. "How is this possible? You're just—" She stopped herself before completing the sentence, perhaps finally recognizing how dangerous it had become to make assumptions about what I was just. The other diners had given up all pretense of their own meals and were now openly watching our table as if we were performing dinner theater, their fascination evident in their leaning postures and suspended conversations. Michael was alternating between staring at the checkbook and looking at his wife with an expression I couldn't quite decipher, part amazement, part disappointment, and part something that might have been shame. The transformation in our family dynamic was happening in real time, witnessed by dozens of strangers who would probably discuss this dinner for months to come. "The truth is," I said, carefully closing the checkbook and returning it to the velvet pouch along with all the other documents, "I've been wealthy for over 20 years, and tonight you've shown me exactly why my grandmother insisted I keep it secret." The finality in my voice seemed to penetrate Sandra's shock, and she began to understand that this wasn't just a revelation, but a judgment. "When you thought I was poor, you treated me with condescension and cruelty. You planned to ship me off to some cut-rate nursing home and justified it by telling everyone I was just a burden with no resources." My voice remained steady and calm, but the words carried the weight of accumulated hurt and disappointment. The nearby diners were nodding in agreement, their earlier fascination now mixed with obvious disapproval of Sandra's behavior throughout the evening. She had indeed assembled the perfect audience for her own moral indictment. The silence that followed my words was profound and uncomfortable, broken only by the gentle sounds of the restaurant around us and Sandra's shallow breathing as she struggled to process the complete reversal of everything she thought she knew. Michael finally found his voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "Mom, I'm so sorry," he said, his words carrying the weight of years of allowing his wife to treat me poorly while he remained passive. "I should have stood up for you. I should have stopped her." The regret in his voice was genuine, and I felt my anger toward him soften slightly, though the damage done by years of silent complicity couldn't be erased with a simple apology. Sandra, meanwhile, seemed to be experiencing some kind of breakdown, her hands trembling as she reached for her wineglass and nearly knocked it over in the process. The confident woman who had spent the evening lecturing me about my place in the world had been replaced by someone who looked genuinely frightened about what came next. "Sandra," I said, my voice cutting through her panic with surgical precision, "you told me to sit quietly because the whole restaurant was watching." I gestured around us at the dozens of faces still turned toward our table, their expressions ranging from fascination to disapproval to outright condemnation of her earlier behavior. "Well, they're still watching, and they've heard every word of what you've revealed about yourself tonight." The implications of this statement seemed to hit her like a physical blow, and she glanced around wildly as if just now realizing how public her humiliation had become. "These people have seen you try to bully someone you believed was helpless and poor. They've watched you plan to abandon your husband's mother to substandard care while you spend his money on Italian vacations." The moral weight of her actions, laid out clearly in front of an audience she had inadvertently assembled, seemed to physically crush whatever remained of her earlier confidence. The couple behind us was whispering urgently to each other, their voices just loud enough for me to catch fragments about terrible daughter-in-law and treating her own family like that. Similar conversations were happening throughout our section of the restaurant, creating a buzz of disapproval that centered entirely on Sandra's behavior throughout the evening. She seemed to sense the shift in public opinion, her eyes darting from table to table as she encountered expressions of judgment and disgust rather than the sympathy she might have expected. "I didn't mean," she started to say, but her voice trailed off as she realized there was no explanation that could undo what everyone had witnessed. The restaurant had become her courtroom, the other diners her jury, and the verdict was clearly not in her favor. Even our waiter, who had been hovering nearby throughout the entire exchange, was looking at her with barely concealed contempt. Michael was staring at his hands again, his face showing the kind of deep shame that comes from recognizing complicity in something genuinely wrong. "All those years," he murmured, more to himself than to either of us. "All those times she made those comments, and I just let it happen." The realization seemed to hit him in waves, each one bringing fresh understanding of how he'd failed in his duty as a son. I thought maybe she was right, that you needed our help, that you were struggling." His voice broke slightly as he began to understand how thoroughly his wife had manipulated his perceptions, and how willingly he'd allowed it to happen. The other diners were watching this family reckoning with the kind of fascination usually reserved for compelling television dramas. Except this was real and happening in their immediate vicinity during what had started as ordinary Friday night dinners. "The saddest part," I continued, my voice carrying clearly through the hushed restaurant, "is that I would have gladly helped you both if you'd ever treated me with basic respect and kindness." Sandra's face crumpled as the full implications of this statement sank in. Not only had she revealed herself as cruel and grasping, but she'd also thrown away a relationship with someone who could have made all her financial dreams come true. Your Italian vacation, your kitchen renovation, your luxury lifestyle. I could have funded all of it without even noticing the expense. The irony was almost too perfect. In her greed to push me aside and access what she thought was Michael's money, she'd destroyed any chance of accessing mine. The nearby diners were shaking their heads in amazement at her spectacular miscalculation, their conversations creating a symphony of judgment that seemed to grow louder with each passing moment. Sandra finally managed to speak, though her voice was barely audible above the restaurant's background noise. "I didn't know," she whispered, as if this explanation might somehow excuse her behavior throughout the evening. "How could I have known?" The question revealed the fundamental flaw in her thinking. She believed that kindness and respect should be conditional on someone's net worth rather than their humanity. "That's exactly the point," I replied firmly. "You should have treated me well because I'm Michael's mother and a human being deserving of basic dignity, not because of what I might be able to do for you financially." The moral lesson seemed to resonate with the other diners, several of whom were nodding in agreement while continuing to stare at our table with undisguised fascination. The woman at the table behind us was explaining to her companion in increasingly animated whispers how Sandra had completely brought this on herself. Our waiter finally approached with the check, though he seemed almost reluctant to interrupt the drama unfolding at our table. "Thank you for dining with us this evening," he said formally, though his eyes lingered on the velvet pouch where it sat like a small monument to Sandra's miscalculations. I reached for the leather folder containing our bill, but Sandra's hand shot out to intercept it with desperate urgency. "Please, let me," she said, her voice carrying the kind of pleading tone I'd never heard from her before tonight. "It's the least I can do after." Her words trailed off as she seemed to realize that no amount of gesturing toward the check would erase what had happened. I allowed her to take the folder, watching as her hands trembled slightly while she opened it to reveal a total of $347 for our anniversary dinner at Romano's. The amount that would have represented a significant expense for the woman she thought I was now seemed almost insultingly small, given what she'd learned about my actual financial situation. Michael was studying his wife's face with an expression I'd never seen before, part recognition, part disappointment, and part something that might have been the beginning of real understanding about who he'd married. "Sandra," he said quietly, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to tell me the truth." She looked up from fumbling with her credit card, her eyes wide with what appeared to be genuine fear about what question might be coming. "If you had known about Mom's money from the beginning, would you have treated her differently?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the restaurant's wood-fired grill, its implications clear to everyone within earshot. The nearby diners had stopped even pretending to have their own conversations, openly listening for Sandra's response to what amounted to a character test with their entire future as witnesses. Even the background music seemed quieter, as if the universe itself was waiting for her answer. Sandra's mouth opened and closed several times without producing any sound, creating the impression of a fish gasping for air on dry land. The silence stretched uncomfortably as she apparently struggled to formulate a response that wouldn't further incriminate her in front of her husband and their involuntary audience. That's not fair," she finally managed to say, though her voice lacked any conviction. "You can't ask someone to answer hypothetical questions about things that didn't happen." Her evasion was as revealing as any direct answer could have been, and I saw Michael's face harden as he processed the implications of her inability to simply say she would have been kind regardless of my financial status. The couple behind us was shaking their heads in obvious disgust, while other diners throughout the restaurant exchanged meaningful glances that suggested Sandra's non-answer had confirmed their worst assumptions about her character. "That wasn't a hypothetical question," Michael said, his voice carrying a new note of authority that I hadn't heard in years. "That was a question about who you are as a person, and your inability to answer it tells me everything I need to know." The transformation in my son was remarkable to witness. The passive man who had allowed his wife to dominate family conversations was being replaced by someone who seemed to be remembering his own moral compass. Sandra's credit card clattered against the table as she set it down with shaking hands, her face cycling through expressions of panic, anger, and desperation. "Michael, you're not being fair," she protested, but her voice carried the hollow ring of someone who knew they'd already lost the argument. "I've been a good wife to you. I've supported your career. I've made a beautiful home for us." Her litany of supposed virtues seemed to fall flat in the face of what everyone had witnessed throughout the evening. "Have you been a good daughter-in-law?" Michael asked, his question cutting straight to the heart of the matter. "Because that's what we're really talking about here. How you've treated my mother for the entire time I've known you." Sandra's face went through another series of color changes as she apparently tried to formulate some defense of her years of condescending comments, passive-aggressive suggestions, and outright cruelty. The restaurant had become completely silent around us, with even the kitchen staff seeming to pause in their preparations to listen to this family confrontation that had evolved into something resembling a public tribunal. "I tried to help her," Sandra said weakly, but the words sounded unconvincing even to her own ears. "I suggested solutions for her living situation. I included her in family events." Her voice faded as she began to understand how her help and inclusion looked when viewed through the lens of what everyone now knew about my actual circumstances. I decided it was time to deliver the final piece of information that would complete Sandra's education about the consequences of her choices. "There's one more thing you should know," I said, reaching into my purse to withdraw a smaller document that I'd kept separate from the others. 3 months ago, I updated my will. The words seemed to hit Sandra like a physical blow, and she gripped the edge of the table as if she needed support to remain upright. Michael's eyes widened as he began to understand the implications of this revelation, while the other diners leaned forward with renewed interest. Originally, I had planned to leave everything to Michael, with the understanding that he would share it appropriately with his family. The past tense of my statement wasn't lost on anyone, and Sandra's breathing became visibly more shallow as she processed what this might mean for her carefully planned future of luxury and leisure. "But watching how you both treated me when you thought I had nothing made me reconsider those plans," I continued, unfolding the document to reveal the letterhead of the estate planning attorney who had helped me restructure my legacy. "My new will establishes a charitable foundation that will distribute the majority of my wealth to organizations that help elderly people who actually are in the difficult financial situations you assumed I was in." Sandra made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a moan, her hands flying to her mouth as the full implications of this revelation hit her. The nearby diners were nodding in approval of this decision, their expressions suggesting they found poetic justice in my choice to redirect wealth toward people who genuinely needed help, rather than those who had treated me poorly while assuming I was helpless. Michael's face had gone completely white, and his voice was barely audible when he spoke. "Mom, you're cutting me out of your will." The hurt in his question was genuine, but I could also hear the beginning of understanding about why such a drastic step might be necessary. Not entirely, I replied, softening my tone slightly because despite everything, he was still my son. You'll receive enough to be comfortable, to pay off your mortgage, maybe start that consulting firm you used to talk about before you got so focused on Sandra's spending plans. The specific mention of his old dreams seemed to hit him particularly hard, and I could see tears forming in his eyes as he remembered the ambitious young man he'd once been. But the bulk of the estate will go to people who understand what it means to struggle without attacking others who they perceive as struggling alongside them. Sandra finally found her voice again, though it emerged as a high-pitched whine that carried clearly through the now silent restaurant. "You can't do this to us," she said, her words revealing the entitlement that had been driving her behavior all along. "We're your family. We deserve—" She stopped herself before completing the sentence, perhaps finally recognizing how dangerous the word deserve had become in the context of their treatment of me throughout the evening. "What do you deserve?" I asked quietly, though the question was clearly rhetorical. "Do you deserve wealth you didn't earn because you married someone whose mother you've spent years trying to humiliate and marginalize?" The moral weight of this question seemed to settle over the entire restaurant, creating an atmosphere so charged with tension that even the background music seemed intrusive. The transformation in Sandra was complete now. The confident, cruel woman who had orchestrated this entire evening had been replaced by someone who looked genuinely terrified about her future. "I can change," she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. "I can be better. I can treat you with respect." Her desperate promises fell flat in the face of years of established behavior, and even she seemed to recognize how hollow they sounded. "The time for that choice was before tonight," I replied firmly. "You had years to decide what kind of person you wanted to be, and you made that decision consistently, every time you spoke to me with condescension, every time you suggested I was a burden, every time you tried to convince Michael that I needed to be managed rather than respected." The litany of her choices created a damning portrait that resonated with everyone who had witnessed her behavior throughout the evening. Michael was staring at his wife with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger exactly, but something that might have been recognition of a fundamental incompatibility he'd been refusing to acknowledge. "Sandra," he said slowly, "I need you to think very carefully about what you say next." The warning in his voice was clear, and she seemed to sense that she was approaching some kind of point of no return in their relationship. "Everything you've said tonight, everything you've done, it wasn't about concern for Mom's welfare or even about money. It was about power, about putting someone down so you could feel superior." His analysis was devastatingly accurate, and Sandra's face crumpled as she realized that her husband was finally seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time in their marriage. The other diners were watching this marital crisis unfold with the kind of fascination usually reserved for compelling theater, except this was real and happening in their immediate vicinity. Our waiter returned to collect the check, moving with the careful neutrality of someone trying not to intrude on a private family matter that had become very public. Sandra mechanically signed the receipt, her signature shaky and uncertain, while Michael sat in stunned silence, processing everything he'd learned about both his wife and his mother in the span of a single dinner. The transaction felt almost surreal, given the magnitude of what had transpired. Here we were completing the mundane business of paying for our meal, while the fundamental structure of our family relationships lay in ruins around us. "Thank you for dining with us," the waiter said diplomatically, though his eyes lingered on me with obvious respect and curiosity. I could tell that our story would become restaurant legend, the tale of the elderly woman who revealed herself to be secretly wealthy while exposing her daughter-in-law's cruelty to an audience of dozens. As we prepared to leave Romano's, the other diners made no attempt to hide their continued fascination with our table. Several people nodded respectfully in my direction as we gathered our belongings, their expressions suggesting approval of how I'd handled Sandra's public humiliation attempt. "Mrs. One elderly gentleman at a nearby table started to say, then paused as he realized he didn't know my name. "Thank you for reminding us that dignity isn't about money," he said simply, and his words seemed to capture the sentiment of many who had witnessed the evening's events. Sandra kept her eyes fixed on the floor as we prepared to leave, apparently unable to face the judgment she could sense in every glance from our fellow diners. The woman who had confidently orchestrated my public humiliation just hours earlier was now the one who couldn't bear to make eye contact with strangers. The walk to the parking lot was conducted in complete silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts about what had transpired and what it meant for our relationships going forward. Michael walked between Sandra and me, creating a physical buffer that seemed to represent the emotional distance that had opened up between all of us. The evening air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and the distant sounds of traffic from the main road. "Mom," Michael finally said as we reached our cars, his voice heavy with years of accumulated regret. "I don't know how to apologize for what happened tonight." The pain in his words was genuine, and I felt my anger toward him soften slightly, though the hurt he'd allowed to accumulate over years of passive complicity couldn't be erased with a single conversation. Sandra stood beside her car like a statue, her keys in her hand, but seemingly unable to process the simple task of unlocking the door. The confident woman who had spent the evening lecturing me about my place in the world had been replaced by someone who looked genuinely lost, as if the revelation of my wealth had fundamentally altered her understanding of reality itself. "What happens now?" she asked, though her question seemed directed more toward the universe than toward any specific person. The answer, of course, was that everything had changed. Not just her perception of me, but Michael's perception of her, and quite possibly their entire future together. The carefully constructed life they'd built on assumptions about my poverty and powerlessness had collapsed in the space of a single dinner, leaving them to navigate a completely altered landscape of family relationships and financial realities. "Now," I said, adjusting my grandmother's earrings one final time as they caught the parking lot's fluorescent lighting, "you both get to decide what kind of people you want to be going forward." The weight of choice settled over us like fog rolling in from the ocean, carrying with it all the implications of paths taken and opportunities lost. For 23 years, I've been carrying these documents and this secret, watching and waiting to see who would show me genuine love and respect when they thought I had nothing to offer. The test had been unconscious on their part, but very deliberate on mine, and the results had been more revealing than I'd ever expected them to be. Sandra's face was streaked with tears now, though whether they represented genuine remorse or simply fear about her changed circumstances remained unclear. Michael approached me slowly, his movements tentative, as if he were afraid I might disappear like a mirage if he came too close. "Is there any way to fix this?" he asked, and I could hear the little boy he'd once been in his voice, the child who had come to me with scraped knees and broken toys, believing that mothers could fix anything if they just tried hard enough. "Some things can be repaired," I replied carefully, "but they're never quite the same as they were before they broke." The metaphor seemed to resonate with him, and he nodded slowly as he began to understand that whatever relationship we rebuilt would need to be fundamentally different from what had come before. Trust, once broken, requires completely new foundations rather than simple patches over the damaged areas. Sandra finally managed to unlock her car, though her hands were still shaking as she opened the door. "I never meant for any of this to happen," she said, though her words lacked the conviction needed to make them meaningful. "You meant for me to be humiliated in front of a restaurant full of people," I replied matter-of-factly. "You succeeded in creating a public spectacle. It just didn't go the way you planned." The accuracy of this observation seemed to hit her like a physical blow, and she slumped against her car as if she needed its support to remain upright. The irony was perfect. She had indeed orchestrated a memorable evening at Romano's, complete with shocked audiences and dramatic revelations, but she had cast herself as the villain rather than the victor in her own production. As Sandra drove away into the night, her taillights disappearing around the corner like the last remnants of the life she'd thought she was going to live, Michael and I stood alone in the parking lot, surrounded by the weight of everything that had changed between us. "Will you ever be able to forgive me?" he asked, his voice barely audible above the distant sounds of traffic and the gentle hum of the restaurant's air conditioning unit. The question was fair, but complicated, involving as it did not just tonight's revelations, but years of accumulated disappointments and missed opportunities for him to stand up for what was right. "Forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened," I said finally. "It's about deciding whether someone is worth the effort of rebuilding trust." The distinction was important, and I could see him processing its implications as he stood there in the fluorescent glow of the parking lot lights. We agreed to meet for coffee the following week, a small step toward whatever relationship we might be able to construct from the wreckage of the evening's revelations. As I drove home through the quiet suburban streets, I found myself thinking about Grandma Rose and the wisdom she'd shared about the true value of wealth. Money, she'd always said, was just a tool. Its worth lay not in what it could buy, but in what it revealed about the people around you when they thought you didn't have it. Tonight had been the ultimate test of that philosophy, and while the results had been painful, they had also been illuminating in ways that no amount of money could buy. The velvet pouch sat beside me on the passenger seat, its contents having served their purpose at last, after more than 2 decades of patient waiting. My apartment looked exactly the same when I returned, though everything felt different after the evening's revelations. The modest furnishings that Sandra had dismissed as evidence of poverty now seemed like conscious choices rather than financial limitations, and the simple decor that she'd mocked as outdated felt peaceful rather than inadequate. I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window overlooking the city lights, reflecting on how dramatically relationships could shift when hidden truths finally came to light. The financial documents were safely returned to their velvet sanctuary, but their brief public appearance had accomplished something that decades of secrecy had not. They had forced everyone in my family to confront who they really were when they thought no one important was watching. The phone rang 3 times over the next hour, twice from numbers I didn't recognize, probably fellow diners from Romano's who had somehow tracked down my information and wanted to discuss the evening's events, and once from Michael, though I let that call go to voicemail. Tomorrow would bring difficult conversations and complex decisions about forgiveness, trust, and the possibility of rebuilding damaged relationships, but tonight I simply wanted to sit quietly with my grandmother's earrings, catching the lamplight, and remember her voice telling me that dignity was something no one could take away unless you gave them permission. The test that had begun 23 years ago with her death had finally reached its conclusion, and while the results were bittersweet, they were also liberating in ways I hadn't anticipated. As I prepared for bed, I caught sight of myself in the mirror and saw not the old woman with no money that Sandra had described, but someone who had successfully navigated one of the most challenging evenings of her life with grace and strategic precision. The revelation of my wealth had been satisfying, but the revelation of everyone's true character had been invaluable. Tomorrow I would begin the process of deciding which relationships were worth salvaging and which charitable organizations would benefit most from the foundation I was establishing. But tonight I would sleep peacefully, knowing that I had honored my grandmother's memory and her lessons about the true nature of wealth. The velvet pouch rested safely in my purse, its secrets finally shared, but its deeper wisdom now part of the legacy I would pass on to future generations. Not through money, but through the understanding that how we treat others when we think they have nothing to offer reveals everything about who we truly are.